Well, it's exactly a month to elections from today, and the economy is one of the main talking points in the run-up to the vote. With a technical recession last year and the cost of living increasing at an alarming rate, South Africans are worried. Now, political economist Moeletsi Mbeki has written a research article looking back at the country's political economy since 1910. That's when, of course, the Union of South Africa was formed. And he also suggests ways of how we can move forward in a different way. Well, he's with us this morning to discuss his Tale of Two Nationalisms and How They Have Failed South Africa research paper. Good morning, sir. Thank you very much for your time.
Morning.
Yeah, I was looking at the summary that we got from your office when we were preparing for this interview, and you're pointing out that you've done this research over years to try and understand South Africa's economic development of nationalism, which has been the dominant political force in the country since 1910. And when I looked at it, I saw on the one hand, you've got what you call Afrikaner nationalism, and since 94, African nationalism. And I just thought, just ask you an overriding question first. Is it fair to compare the two?
Yes, it is very fair to compare the two because they are actually a product of British colonialism. Both the Afrikaner nationalism and the African nationalism. They are aggrieved by the British who conquered South Africa and subdued the population, including the nationalists. So the nationalists were trying to break out of British domination. So it is fair to compare the two.
So the Afrikaner nationalists were doing that. The African nationalists also were rising up and resisting all forms of British colonialism. What would be the common things, I mean, if there are any that you have found? Because the main differentiator from what I've read seems to be around ownership of productive assets, which the Afrikaner nationalists built through state-owned enterprises. Some of them are still around today. And African nationalism haven't had that, but they've made political changes since 1994.
Yes, the important differentiator is these two groups inherited the state that the British built. The British, when they discovered the diamond and the gold, they realized that these are very valuable assets. They had to build a new state in South Africa. So they disempowered and destroyed the power of all the communities that they found in place in South Africa. They destroyed the power of the Zulu kingdom, for example, and they destroyed the power of the Boers. And they reshaped South Africa so that they could exploit these industries. So the British created the South African state. They then said to the Afrikaner nationalists, now, you run the state, we get our gold, and when the nationalists said, this is how we're going to run it, the Afrikaner nationalists. So the British said, okay, fine. The Afrikaner nationalists said, we're going to exploit black labor, we're going to keep the blacks out of parliament, because you can't exploit people while they are sitting in parliament.
We're going to dispossess them from the land.
We're going to dispossess them from... So the British said, okay, you go ahead. As long as we get our gold and our diamonds, we're happy with this. So they handed over South Africa in 1910. But of course, this model is very problematic. So somewhere along the line, it could not be sustained because of the violence. So in the 1970s, it started to fall apart, really fall apart, and there were huge strikes in South Africa in the 70s, and then the student uprising. Eventually, they had to give up power. And the British were still there. Margaret Thatcher was one of the people who piloted and advised de Klerk that, look, your time is up. So they then passed on inherited this British state to the African nationalists, which was the ANC. And they said, okay, but the British are still saying, well, we will have our gold and our diamonds, but you can run the country. So how you manage the state and what use you put the state to is the key differentiator between these two. Is not because one is black and the other is white. Is how do they use the state? Now, the Afrikaners, if you remember, took land from the Africans. So they had farms. So they use the state to develop their farms. So if you look at our railway network, for example, our railway network is massive, but it goes to the platteland to go and collect maize.
For transportation of the agricultural produce.
Yeah.
Now, the African nationalists with the ANC in power from 1994 did something else more from what you've pointed out, from what you found out in your research, and you're talking about they opened the economy to international players, which because after sanctions, after apartheid, this was open. But has that investment really benefited the country?
Well, to some extent, it has. We've had new companies, new technology being brought into South Africa. Remember the sanctions, for example, you couldn't buy computers, certainly from the United States. This was part of the sanctions program. So South Africa was able to bring in new companies. Vodacom, for example. Vodacom is partly owned by British Telecommunications. So you brought those kind of, and then you created our own telecommunication companies like MTN. Yeah.
So there has been that kind of thing. But now, from what you are saying here, these systems have not really made us successful up to now, from 1910. What should change? What can be changed, in your view?
Well, what has to change is a number of things. You see, each of these nationalist groups has its own models. The National Party's model was apartheid, obviously, and the oppression of black labor. The ANC's model and the African nationalist model is different. Democracy is their model because obviously the blacks are the majority, so they always win the elections. But the model of the African nationalists is one of consumption. So you build the so-called black middle class, but you build them through state employment and through affirmative action.
BEE, for example?
BEE is a cornerstone of this program. But now, BEE discourages investment. If I'm an investor sitting, say, in Sweden or in London or in China, I come to invest in South Africa, and I have to cede 26% of my capital to a BEE partner, who pays nothing actually for what you get.
And you think that's not the workable model, that's not sustainable?
It's not a sustainable model, and that's one of the causes of the lack of investment in South Africa.
Now, another point you make very briefly before you go, Mr. Mbeki, is that there might be a need for electoral reforms where we have the way forward in terms of this democracy that the African nationalists have brought to South Africa. Electoral reforms, we're going for elections soon, on the 8th of May, and we are talking about a constituency base versus a proportional representation thing. Yeah. Would that help this country's longevity in terms of democratic practices?
Oh, absolutely. You see, for example, this huge investigation that Justice Zondo is undertaking now, it would never have happened if the members of parliament were elected by constituencies. Because the members of parliament are on the party list, when, for example, there was a motion of no confidence in President Zuma, the whip just told the members of parliament, defend Zuma. So they kept defending him. If you have a constituency, you are answerable to your constituency, not to your party boss. So it would have protected us enormously from the disaster of corruption that has become so pervasive in South Africa.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your views and sharing some of the insights about your tale of two nationalisms and how they have failed South Africa and what kind of changes can be made. Thank you very much, sir.